Okay, so prior to this pandemic, you'd written a book, you were doing live events, you were busy running a company, all of the things. Take us back a little bit before then. I know some of where you came from. I've been fortunate to see you speak live, but tell my listeners, if they don't know some of your context, some of your backstory, how'd you get to this place where now you're writing your second book?
Yeah. Well, I grew up inside of entertainment. I mean, I grew up in Southern California, San Clemente, hello, and went to Pepperdine. I was kind of like a beach human for the entirety of my life. I immediately out of college got into entertainment, where for about 20 years, I worked at 20th Century Fox with Merv Griffin in a production company, a handful of different things before a 17-year career at the Walt Disney Company. And I, got so many amazing
like my dream.
Right. I mean, by the way, it was also my dream. And so I was the beneficiary of some amazing coaches and teachers and leaders who were great mentors, affording me opportunities. Yep. Some combination of hard work, but a lot of luck and a lot of opportunity. And at the end of my 17 years at the Walt Disney Company, the last 7, I was the head of sales for the movie studio. So I put movies into theaters, which was just the most incredible job, because it wasn't just Disney, it was Marvel, Pixar, Lucas, and Disney. So some of the greatest intellectual property in the entire world. I got the job at 36. So it's 10 years ago now that I got the job. I'm 46 now. And I was not the most qualified candidate for the job necessarily. I had as my right and left hand the head of domestic and the head of international, people who were 20 years my senior and had 25 more years of experience than I did necessarily. And the learning curve at the beginning was so exhilarating. I was growing every single day, probably more than anything, because I was making mistakes and asking a lot of dumb questions every single day. And 3.5 years in, the learning curve itself was something that felt like it was a little bit easier for me to get a handle on how to do the job and do it well. And the strength of that intellectual property, the strength of the leadership at the company, the strength of the creatives inside of each of those brands were so amazing that my work to convince movie theaters that they needed to buy an Avengers movie or buy a Star Wars movie just didn't take as much effort. I don't want to downplay that it still, of course, took work, but it just didn't take as much. And so I found myself, as I'm crossing this threshold between 30 and 40, around my 40th birthday, asking this bigger set of existential questions of, why am I on this planet? Why have I been given all these gifts? And yet I don't have to study to get straight A's on tests. And that dissonance that existed had me really kind of reaching for fulfillment in a world where it didn't really present itself in a way that it felt like it should have, right? Like to the outside, this job is the greatest, and I've got a healthy family, and we're, doing well against a whole bunch of measures. And yet I'm feeling like I'm in a funk. And I'm out back right around that 40-year-old birthday, and my middle son asks me a very innocent question in a time that we had out in our jacuzzi, where I said, look, you can ask any question you want. And he asks, what are you most afraid of? And out of my mouth falls, not living up to my potential. And what was interesting in that real-time moment as I'm wrestling with these existential questions is that I was in real time living into my greatest fear by continuing to stay inside of something that was safe and comfortable for the way it might provide for my family or the status it might afford me, but not challenge me, but not have me growing. And so I started inside of this, ditch that in some ways was self-inflicted. I'm digging at myself at some points, trying to figure out, how the heck do I get out of this? How do I find fulfillment? And the tie that I could see in the work that I started to do was that if you're not growing, you cannot be fulfilled. And I really do believe, hey, you're either growing or you're dying. I don't think that there is a treading water version. You're growing or dying. And I was in that window. I was dying because I wasn't having to necessarily be outside of my comfort zone to do really well at my work. And so I started then, asking a new set of questions. Well, how might I create opportunities that introduce discomfort, that introduce something that would break the muscle down to build it back up? And the decision to leave the Walt Disney Company was the one that spoke loudest to me. I'd like to say I left my career for my calling. There was this thing that was intuitively whispering, and that whisper became a scream. And in this last 3 years, this bigger question of how might I honor the intention of my creator, right? I was made, like anyone who's listening, with a very specific set of deliberately designed things, intricacies, skills, and talents. And I want to every day do what I can to honor that intention, as I was put here for a reason. And so I left the Walt Disney Company. I moved the family to Austin, Texas, and start inside of an entrepreneurial journey at the time, the Hollis Company. And it was definitely the thing that was uncomfortable. It was definitely the thing that was producing growth, because it was just wildly divergent from anything I'd experienced inside of this team that I had, thousands of people in 75 countries, subject matter experts that always could put out fires before they even started, to a small team that required rolled up sleeves, nails dirty, putting out fires at a frequency that I just had never experienced in my life. And it was amazing and hard. It was, like in some respects, the most important turning points at that 42 mark, to become a catalyst for everything that I'll do for the rest of my life. And it was also a byproduct of having to deal with some super hard stuff, triggering stuff, decisions that at times I was making, and coping mechanisms, or the way that I was listening to my own insecurity, or the imposter syndrome as it would flare up. And it has produced, because of all of that, the headwinds that came in the decision to push into something uncomfortable, just massive growth, massive discovery, self-discovery in the work that has, unfolded over these last few years. And I worked inside this business for, a couple years. And then in the transition of our marriage, hey, we're not going to be married anymore. The last year has arguably been one of the hardest years of my life, and has also simultaneously been one of the best years of my life. The change that I chose in leaving Disney was rivaled by the change that chose me in the ending of my marriage. And in either way, the change that happens in life often ends up being the catalyst that produces the most important and best growth in our lives. And so I find myself now really writing in a bit of a blank canvas, a blank piece of paper, describing what my future will look like now that it isn't going to look necessarily like what I thought it might a year ago. And that's equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. That's, that's for anyone who does anything to follow intuition or listen to a calling or whatever it might be, taking that first step is often the most daunting of them, but it ends up just being the first in a series of pretty daunting steps as you continue to push toward your fear into a space where you might learn, and ultimately through the learning start to grow. I can say, I feel like I am the healthiest I've ever been. I am most connected to my faith. I am closest I've ever been to my kids. I have strong relationships, and much of it ends up being the byproduct of hard conditions, of headwinds and challenging stuff that required asking a question. How are you going to turn the things that are happening into something that's for you, not happening to you? And I feel great as a result. I don't want to necessarily relive 2020, like I'm sure most people don't want to necessarily relive 2020. But if you can look at the year that's, a thing that we've all just come through as having created some tenacity or something in how we have grown or become a little bit closer to this version of who we'd hope to be, then we can look at it with some degree of gratitude, even if we don't necessarily want to have to experience it again.